Welcome to ECHO 451, International Trade Theory, Chapter 1. Introduction. This study begins with the traditional international trade models, which includes absolute advantage model and comparative advantage model. These were the ideas of the classical economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo respectively, presented about 200 years ago to support the claim that there were mutual gains from trade, a major contrast to the then prevailing mercantilistic view that export make a country to gain while import lead to a loss. Smith assumed that each country could produce one or more commodities at a lower real cost than its trading partners. It then follows that each country would benefit from specialization in those commodities in which it has an absolute advantage. The Ricardian model introduces us to the ideal that technological differences across countries matter. It maintains that trade will benefit both nations provided only that their relative cost, that is, the ratios of their real cost in terms of labor inputs, are different for two or more commodities. Comparative advantage. Adam Smith's original statement of the case for trade, contained in his epic The Wealth of Nations 1776, was couched in terms of absolute cost differences between countries. That is, Smith assumed that each country could produce one or more commodities at a lower real cost than its trading partners. It then follows that each country will benefit from specialization in those commodities in which it has an absolute advantage. That is, can produce at lower rate cost than another country, exporting them and importing other commodities that it produces at a higher real cost than does another country. Real cost for Smith meant the amount of labor time required to produce a commodity. His analysis was based on the labor theory of value, which treats labor as the only factor of production, and holds that commodities exchange for one another in proportion to the number of hours required for their production. For example, if 10 hours of labor are required to produce a bag of cocoa and 40 hours to produce a pair of shoes, then 4 bags of cocoa will exchange for 1 pair of shoes. The labor embodied in 4 bags of cocoa equals the labor embodied in 1 pair of shoes. This argument holds for a given market area within which labor can move freely from one industry to another and one place to another. Within a single country, competition ensures that commodities exchange in the market in proportion to their labor cost. In our example of cocoa and shoes, no one would give more than 4 bags of cocoa for 1 pair of shoes because that would entail a cost of more than 40 hours of labor to obtain a pair of shoes. One instead can obtain a pair of shoes directly by expending 40 hours of labor. No one would accept fewer than 4 bags of cocoa for 1 pair of shoes for the same reason. Competition in the market and the mobility of labor between industries within a nation thus cause goods to exchange in proportion to their labor cost. Because of legal and cultural restrictions, however, labor does not move freely between nations. To simplify the analysis, we make the classical economist assumption that labor is completely immobile between nations. If labor requirements differ across countries, then in the absence of trade, prices of goods will differ across countries. Adam Smith ignored the way an equilibrium price might be reached among trading nations. He instead demonstrated the proposition that a nation benefited from trade in which it exported those commodities it could produce at lower rate cost than other countries and imported those commodities it produced at a higher rate cost than other countries. An arithmetical example helps to illustrate the case of absolute cost differences. Suppose that, as shown in Table 1.1, in Nigeria, it takes 30 days to produce a bag of cocoa and 120 days to produce a pair of shoes. Whereas in Italy, it takes 100 days to produce a bag of cocoa and only 20 days to produce a pair of shoes. Each commodity is assumed to be identical in both countries. Clearly, Nigeria has an absolute advantage in cocoa production. It can produce a bag of cocoa at a lower real cost than can Italy, whereas Italy has an absolute advantage in shoe production. Consequently, each country will benefit by specializing in the commodity in which it has an absolute advantage, obtaining the other commodity through trade. The benefit derives from obtaining the imported commodity at a lower real cost through trade than through direct production at home. In the absence of trade, in Nigeria, one bag of cocoa will exchange for 4 pairs of shoes because they require equal amounts of labor. In Italy, one pair of shoes will exchange for 1/5 of a bag of cocoa. Nigeria will benefit if it can trade less than 4 bags of cocoa for 1 pair of shoes. Italy if it can obtain more than 1/5 of a bag of cocoa for 1 pair of shoes. Clearly, both countries can gain at an intermediate ratio such as 1 bag of cocoa for 1 pair of shoes. By shifting 120 days of labor from shoes to cocoa, Nigeria could produce 4 additional bags of cocoa worth 4 pairs of shoes in trade with Italy. Nigeria gets 4 bags of cocoa instead of 1. Italy obtains a similar gain through specialization in shoes. The nature of the possible efficiency gains for the combined economies of Nigeria and Italy in this situation can be seen by noting what will happen if each country shifts 600 days of labor from the production of the commodity in which it is inefficient to what one it produces efficiently. If Nigeria moves 600 labor days from shoes production to cocoa, while Italy shifts 600 labor days in the opposite direction, the production changes shown in Table 2 will occur in each country. With no increase in labor inputs, the combined economy of the 2 countries gains 14 bags of cocoa and 25 pairs of shoes. These gains in the production of both goods resulted from merely shifting 600 labor days in each country toward more efficient uses. If 1,200 labor days were shifted by each country instead of 600, the gains would be twice as large. Table 1.2, the gain in output from trade with an absolute advantage. This explanation based on absolute advantage certainly suffices to account for important segments of international trade. Brazil can produce coffee at a lower real cost than can Germany. Florida can produce oranges at a lower cost than Iceland. Australia can produce wool at a lower real cost than Switzerland. But what if a nation or an individual does not have an absolute advantage in any line of production? Does trade then offer it no benefit? The Ricardian model. David Ricardo clearly showed in his Principles of Political Economy 1817 that absolute cost advantages are not a necessary condition for 2 nations to gain from trade with each other. Instead, trade will benefit both nations provided only that their relative cost, that is, the ratios of their real cost in terms of labor input, are different for 2 or more commodities. In short, trade depends on differences in comparative advantage, and one nation can profitably trade with another even though its real costs are higher or lower in every commodity. Table 1.3, an example of comparative advantage. This point can best be explained through a numerical example. Consider the potential trade in crude oil and television set between Nigeria and England. The cost of producing a barrel of crude oil or 1 television set in each of the 2 countries measured in terms of days of labor are given in Table 1.3. The table shows that England is more efficient at the production of both goods. Less labor is required to produce either good in England. than in Portugal. That fact is irrelevant. However, what is important is that Nigeria has a comparative advantage in oil, whereas England has a comparative advantage in television set. England can produce either 2 barrels of oil or 1 television set with the same amount of labor 4 days by shifting labor from crude oil to television set production. It can transform 2 barrels of oil into 1 television set. Nigeria, however, can produce either 3.33 barrels oil or 1 television set with the same labor 10 days. Therefore, by shifting labor from television set to oil production, Nigeria can transform 1 television set into 3.33 barrels of oil. In comparative terms, television is inexpensive in England and expensive in Nigeria, whereas oil is cheap in Nigeria and costly in England. 1 television set costs only 2 barrels oil in England, but the same television set costs 3.33 barrels of oil in Nigeria. When viewed from the perspective of oil, we see that a barrel costs 1/2 of 1 television set in England, but only 1/3 of 1 television set in Nigeria. These differences in the relative cost of one good in terms of the other create Nigeria's comparative advantage in oil and England's in television set. The efficiency gains that this pattern of comparative advantage makes possible can be seen by imagining that Nigeria shifts 60 days of labor from the production of cloth to employment in the oil industry, whereas England shifts 36 days of labor in the opposite direction, that is, from oil to television set production. Given the labor cost presented in Table 1.3, the result of this shift of labor use would be as shown in Table 1.4. The combined economies of Nigeria and England can use 2 more barrels of oil and watch television sets using 3 more television sets, even though there has been no increase in labor use. Note that to guarantee that total output of both goods rises, Nigeria must shift more labor days than England because Nigeria produces less efficiently in absolute terms. If both countries had shifted the same number of labor days, there would have been a far larger increase in television set production and a small reduction in oil output. Table 1.4, the gain in output from trade with comparative advantage. Another way to understand the nature of these gains is to imagine that someone had the monopoly right to trade between London and Lagos. If the labor cost presented in Table 1.3 prevailed and labor were the only input, the price ratios faced by the monopoly trader in the 2 countries would be as shown in Table 1.5 in Nigeria. 1 television set is 3.33 times as expensive as a barrel of oil, whereas in England, television set is only twice as costly as oil. The difference in these 2 barter ratios creates an enormously profitable opportunity for the monopoly trader starting out with 100 television sets in London. Table 1.5, Domestic exchange ratios in Nigeria and England. The trader ships that merchandise to Lagos, where it can be exchanged for 3.3 barrels of oil. The 3.3 barrels are output. Take 2 barrels are put on the ship back to London, where they are bartered for 166.7 worth of television set. The trader started out with 100 television sets and now has 166.7 sets, thereby earning a return of 66.7% minus shipping cost by simply trading around in a circle between London and Lagos. The monopoly trader merely took advantage of the different price ratios in England and Nigeria, which were based on differing relative labor costs, and made an enormous profit. The monopoly trader merely took advantage of the different price ratios in England and Nigeria, which were based on differing relative labor costs and made an enormous profit. Now imagine that the monopoly has been eliminated and that anyone who wishes to do so can trade between London and Lagos. As large numbers of people purchase clothes in London with the intention of shipping it to Lagos, they would drive the English price of television. When these same people arrive in Lagos and sell this large amount of television sets, they would depress the price. As these same traders buy large amounts of Nigerian oil to ship to London, they would drive the Lagos price of oil up. When they all arrive in London to sell that oil, they will push the price down. As a result of trade, the price ratios are converging. As the price of television set rises in London and falls in Lagos, while the price of wine rises in Nigeria and falls in England, the large profit previously earned by the traders decline in a competitive equilibrium. The differences in the price ratios would be just sufficient to cover transport costs and provide a minimum competitive rate of return for the traders. For simplicity, we will ignore transport costs and the minimum return for the traders. Free trade will result in a single price ratio that prevails in both countries. That price ratio will be somewhere between the two initial price ratios in Nigeria and England. Does this mean that the gains from trade, which were previously concentrated in the profit of the monopoly trader, have disappeared? No, it merely means that these gains have been shifted away from the trader and toward the societies of Nigeria and England. Through changes in the price ratios, when the monopolists controlled trade between the two countries, England had to export one television set to get 2 barrels of oil. Now that competition prevails, the English price of television set has risen while the price of oil has declined. This is the end of study section 1. Thank you for listening.